Hey guys, Jake here, and since the past couple of videos that I've been doing are more so Nintendo related, Nintendo, I guess, strict concerning the Switch and whatnot, I figured I'd take it back a pace and actually look at video games this time. So, 2017 was a huge year for the video game industry. We got a load of amazing, memorable games, and we also got a load of pretty crappy ones too, but in today's video we're going to be looking on my personal top 2 favorite games of 2017 and kind of pitting them against each other in terms of just different gameplay gimmicks. So without further ado, this is Persona 5 versus Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now before we begin, I do want to say that this does contain massive story elements, as I am going to be talking about this and that and everything else that happens within both games' story, and both games' characters, story elements, anything like that. So if you're sensitive to spoilers, then there's your warning. So anyway guys, let's get right to it now. So to start off, let's begin with the tutorial. So going back and forth between these different topics, we're going to be starting with Persona 5 and ending with Breath of the Wild. So to begin with the tutorial segment, let's talk about Persona 5. Now, Persona 5's tutorial, it's extremely lengthy, it's extremely heavy. It does require probably 10 hours or so of the game, out of the 100 plus hours that you're already devoting to the main game's plot. But at the same time, the Persona 5 tutorial, it doesn't necessarily shove every aspect of the game down your throat, but it does give you exactly what you need, how you need it, and it basically gives you the training wheels, or it takes the training wheels off. It kind of depends on how you want to view it. It's just kind of a live and learn situation, experience, I guess is what you would call it. As for Breath of the Wild's tutorial, it's a bit slow-paced in my opinion. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or worse, but there's less going on. It's not nearly as meaty. It's, you meet an old man wants to give you a glider that you can, fly across all of Hyrule with, as long as you have stamina. But he's going to be a butt, requires you to go do these 4 puzzles, and then come back alive and trade in the treasures you find there for the glider thingy. And then from that moment on, you can pretty much do whatever you want with the game. So while it is shorter in terms of explaining it, it's rather lengthy with actually doing it, more so because of how slow-paced Link is by himself, especially with a unedited stamina wheel. There's no horses in the Great Plateau to my knowledge, and at that point too, during the tutorial, even if there were horses, you don't necessarily know how to tame them yet, and you won't until you get out of the Great Plateau into Dueling Peaks Tower. So it's a lot more physically slow-paced than it is verbally. Whereas it's kind of the opposite with Persona 5. While the Persona 5 tutorial does take an extremely amount of time compared to Breath of the Wild, you're not, I guess, grinding. There's something going on after everything you do, so it adds more to your plate without necessarily overwhelming you. And while it's also giving you all these different missions that, eventually lead up to the end of the tutorial, it allows you to understand that you have free reign in and outside of, I guess, of the 2 aspects of Persona 5. So pretty much the first tutorial, the tutorial of Persona 5 is the first dungeon of the game. Everything you do in the first dungeon is pretty much taught to you. The cutscenes as well within the tutorial are amazing, and same for Breath of the Wild, but when it comes to the tutorial as itself, as how it builds up the story, I kind of gotta give it to Persona. So next up is the gameplay. So Persona 5 is a bit weird to explain to people who aren't obviously familiar with it, but basically all of the Persona games are split into 2 factions. You have the Japanese teenage high school simulator segment of the game, which takes up half, if not more, and then you have the dungeon crawling segment of the game, which also takes up half, if not more. It kind of just depends on how you view to play the game, since all of the Persona games pretty much allow you to pick on which one you want to spend more time on, but I can't really speak from a professional's standpoint or experience on that, just from Persona 5's. The gameplay with Breath of the Wild is in real time, whereas Persona 5's dungeon crawling segments are turn-based. So if you're familiar with the OG Final Fantasy formula, or Pokemon, or the Paper Mario RPGs, then yeah, then Persona 5's dungeon crawling segment is going to be nothing aside from... It's going to not be a stranger to you, I guess, if that makes sense. Now, the high school simulation part, that's going to be a tad overwhelming for some players, especially new players, because the simulation part, everything you do within the high school simulation actually does contribute to the dungeon crawling experiences. Like who you hang out with, what you eat, what you do during your free time. It all contributes towards your dungeon crawling. So personally, I really do see that as a strength on how both versions of the game, while as like diverse as they can be, they tie in a really nice and unique way. And I'm speaking for Persona 5, but I know the other Persona games do as well, and I'm unsure about any other franchises that do so. But in my opinion, I kind of feel more comfortable and alive, I guess, when it comes to real-time games. Now, when it comes to turn-based games, when it's your turn in the fight, you can kind of just, sit your controller down and then go do what you gotta do, whether it be chores, whether, you gotta eat or use the bathroom. But when it comes to real-time, there's more of a priority, like you have to get this done because otherwise you're going to die. Now, you can always pause in the middle of Breath of the Wild, but, I mean, why pause when you may possibly kill them within the next 30 or so seconds? So, just because I'm more comfortable and I'm more familiar with real-time battle systems, such as Kingdom Hearts and the newer Final Fantasy games, I'm gonna have to give this to Breath of the Wild just due to the familiarity I had with it. So next up is characters, and oh boy, there is a lot from both games. So actually, I know that I said that I'll be starting with Persona, but I think I do want to start with Breath of the Wild on this one. So for those of you that don't know, Breath of the Wild is actually, I guess it's seen as a conversion of the split Zelda timelines coming back and joining together. So you do have lore and everything from each of the Zelda timelines that before Breath of the Wild weren't related, but now they are. So in some way, shape, or form, there are references to just about every character of the franchise as a whole within the past 30 years, which I honestly think is extremely cool and is such a great nostalgia factor for not only fans that are, that are used to the games and have played it since the early 2000s, if not longer, but also to new fans too, who want to dive into the series. So, although a lot of those are more so Easter eggs rather than character implements themselves, when it comes to the main cast of Breath of the Wild, while they're all memorable, they're not necessarily more of an importance, I get. Now, you do have the four main tribes of the game, the Gerudo, the Rito, the Zora, and the Gorons, that's what they're called. And you do, now you don't necessarily have to go through and visit all of them in order to fight the final boss, but they do assist in that, and they are extremely helpful. They pretty much put the boss at 50 HP, they cut him in half. But as far as like how memorable they are, that's pretty much all they're used for. Now, if you complete the main plot quests, I guess is what you call them, throughout each of the different tribes, now you do get gameplay enhancements. For example, if you complete the Zora main quest, then you get a free revival after so long until it recharges, with extra hearts too. The Gerudo main quest allows you to use this super attack that paralyzes enemies of all shapes and sizes around you. So the characters, they do enhance your gameplay, but that's pretty much all they're used for. After you get them for the gameplay enhancements, that's all you do with them, and then you go and fight the final boss. With Persona, all of the characters mean something. They all have their own motive, their own morals that they fight for, whether they're on your team or not. whether they're enemies, whether they're party members, whether they're bystanders. Pretty much every character in the game has something to say, and it does have some relevance to how you feel about a specific topic of the game, like what's going on in July, because Persona 5 does work with a real year calendar kind of system. So there are daily events, for example, that we have in our real life, such as politics, that also, you know, live and take place within Persona 5, and especially politics, because that's a huge like thing at the end of the game. But so I'm gonna have to give characters to Persona simply due to the fact on how, I guess, relevant and more of a priority all the characters in Persona 5 are, and how, you know, you kind of feel bad for some characters, whether they're good or bad, and, you know, you feel like, you know, one of your party members is stuck up. There's more personality, there's more flesh, there's more meat to it, if that makes any sense. So characters are going to have to go, well, to Persona. So next up is bosses and enemies, and this one I actually did struggle a little bit on coming up with. So when it comes to the bosses of both games, let's look at Breath of the Wild first. So the main 4 bosses of Breath of the Wild are basically different versions of Ganon that reside as the main bosses for each of the different tribes. So basically, once you go to one of those tribes, they'll ask you, hey, we need you to do this thing. Once you go and do that thing, poof, main boss. So there are 4 main bosses that you don't necessarily have to do, but if you want to consider them bosses, then yeah, they're bosses. There's Water Blight Ganon, Thunder Blight Ganon, Flare? Is it Fire or Flare? Whichever, and then Water Blight Ganon. So none of them really have any importance to the gameplay aside from just being the final obstacle in your way. Now, I did see a review on Breath of the Wild, and it was like, why I love Breath of the Wild, but why it could be better, I think is what the title of the video was. I watched it all the way through, I loved it, I think I dropped a like and a comment, and forgive me for forgetting, but I really wish I could quote this guy. He mentioned about changing the aspects of those boss fights, like instead of those different versions of Ganon being what you fight, there are like 2 stages to each of the boss fights, where the first stage you fight a possessed version of each of the champions, and then after you defeat those possessed versions, then you fight those different versions of Ganon, the fire, the thunder, the water, etc., that were possessing the champions. So that aspect I really would have loved, because it would have added more flesh and bone to the boss fights themselves. As far as Persona 5 concerns itself, the bosses make a huge impact on the main cast, because they're pretty much the antagonist for that month and a half, 2 months, whatever. They're the thing that's basically challenging you and your freedom as Japanese high school kids. What freedom? Never mind. So you have some adults that are trying to blackmail you. You have some adults that just straight up don't like you and they want you to see you in jail. You have some adults that are trying to offensively throw themselves onto some of your team members. Notice how all these people are adults, and how all of the different bosses in Persona 5 do relate to I believe the term is mythological, but they do relate to like real life lore and theories and stuff with real life, mythological things. For example, the 8 different dungeons, I guess you would say, in the game relate to the 7 deadly sins. Yeah, I did say 8, but I think one of them is made up for the game itself. Or maybe there is like a secret 8th sin that nobody knows about. I don't know. But there's a lot more, I guess, thought and depth when it comes to the bosses of Persona rather than Breath of the Wild. Now, when it comes to the mainstream enemies, that's kind of where I mix things up. Like I said earlier, Persona 5's gameplay is turn-based. So similar to how in Pokemon, how when you walk in the grass and you see the same Pokemon 50,000 times, that's pretty much what Persona's mainstream enemies feel like when you're walking within the same dungeon and then poof, random or a wild incubus has appeared. You know, you gotta kill the incubus, and then you walk more, and then another a herd of incubus come up, and you gotta kill all of them. With Breath of the Wild, there are herds of enemies that kind of have their own campsite, and they rely on you to come to them versus them staking you out. But they all, I mean, like, there's the same enemy, but they have like different weapons and stuff, and there's different tiers of enemies too. So I do think that the mainstream enemies of Breath of the Wild, I do think that they have more depth, more color, more variety to them, more meat and flesh and bones or whatever than Persona 5's. But I think that Persona 5's bosses have more flesh and bone than Breath of the Wild. So I'm going to have to give those a split 1-1 to both games. Alright, so I just paused the recording, so my dog is now in my room, so if y'all hear in the background, I can assure you that it is not a Ugandan Knuckles, it is indeed my dog. So continuing on is the user interface. So let's start with Persona 5's just because of how big it is. Now when I say user interface, I basically mean anything that you can access from the game that's more of a menu, like settings, you know, whether it's your inventory, whether it's your gear, things like that that you can always edit and change. Even like a mini-map on the screen, or your health bar, things like that. You know, the attack button, or the runaway button, because, you know, turn-based RPGs have things like that. Yeah, that's basically what I define as user interface. So when we look at Persona 5's user interface, such as the main menu, whether you're dungeon crawling or in your whether you're in the simulation, like the school simulation segment of the game, it's big, I'll admit. You do have to kind of jump through hoops getting from one place to another within the menu. Kind of like opening a bunch of tabs on a web browser and then having multiple web browsers with multiple tabs open. That's totally one way to, I guess, to relate the two. But Persona 5's UI, it changes on what menu you bring upon. So it's like having these different web browsers, but each one is unique in their own different ways and rights. And not only that, but they're each also vibrant and big and explosive in art. And yeah, so that's just kind of the best way to explain Persona's UI. As for Breath of the Wild, it's really simplistic for a free-reign game. You have your health in the top left, you have your stamina vessel that only appears when you obviously use it up, you have your mini-map in the bottom right. Now, Breath of the Wild does introduce hotkeys to the, I guess, to the gameplay, to the point to where, like, how you can press this button, which kind of freezes time, and then you can change out your weapons. I never used any of the hotkeys, aside from changing the puzzle-solving items, such as Magnesis and Stasis, I believe is what it's called. And as far as I'm concerned, using that hotkey is actually the only way to change those. So when it came to swords and shields and everything else that you could change via hotkey, I just simply paused the game. Not only because, you know, I could see a bit more what I was doing, but A, it required me not to press as many buttons. B, I could also just leave the controller down and do what else I gotta do. And so, yeah, I guess when it comes to UI, Breath of the Wild is just kind of bland, but it's bland to the point to where, like, it's not like, oh, it's just a black screen, you know? It's like because Breath of the Wild is a collector's game, kind of like Minecraft, every tab that you open, there is something, but that something is always determined on your own. Whereas with whereas with Persona 5, it gets bigger and it gets more colorful, and more things happen with the UI, like more interactions, more animation, things like that, with the more people that expands in your party. And obviously by the end of the game, you'll know that, you know, you can't expand it anymore. But yeah, I think without a shadow of a doubt, I'm gonna have to give the user interface to Persona 5. So next up is music, and I think it's pretty obvious what I'm gonna say for this one. But I still want to kind of, you know, talk about it. So Breath of the Wild's music, as far as I can remember, or at least if I recall, the director or directors, because I believe that there was at least 2 people working on that game, they were in an interview, excuse me, I think it was a Nintendo Direct, where they talked about the music of the game and why they necessarily chose it. For example, if you're out in the wilderness in Breath of the Wild and you're just walking, you can kind of hear like soft piano keys going on in the background and then building up into like an orchestra. Whereas Persona 5, it's just no matter what you're doing, no matter where you are, you kind of hear, you know, all these like punk, you know, poppy kind of things that get you grooving, get you moving. But Breath of the Wild, it kind of takes into mind that you know, because Breath of the Wild is one of those games where with every corner that you, with every corner you take, there's always something there, whether it be a chest, whether it be a horde of enemies, whether it be a huge mini-boss, whether it be an actual boss fight, there's always something. And so I believe what was said in the interview was that they didn't want to overpower the player with what's going on in the gameplay and the music itself. Whereas Persona 5, I guess, has the ability to overpower people with the music, but it's enjoyable. You know, you don't sit there and you go, oh, I have to listen to this again, like, let me just focus on the game. You sit there and you kind of, you know, tap your feet and shake your hand and nod your head, because on just how, I guess, groovy the music is. And it's like, it's like a, not rock, but it's like a punk funk pop fusion, I guess is like the best way to explain it. But I mean, I personally, I continuously find myself, you know, on Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube looking for new covers of the Persona 5 soundtrack, or for the original things themselves. Whereas with Breath of the Wild, I don't really do that, because Breath of the Wild, while it does have new soundtrack, a lot of the good soundtrack from Breath of the Wild is the same soundtrack that's in all the other Legend of Zelda games, like the main theme and things like that. So, I mean, if anything, I'll just, you know, find like a dubstep version of the Legend of Zelda theme. But I digress, that's just my personal taste on music, and I'm known to have totally awkward and weird tastes from a lot of other people my age. But yeah, music is going to have to go to Persona 5. So next up is plot, and holy moly. Okay, so Persona 5's plot, or at least in the length of a plot, is shorter, technically, than Breath of the Wild's, but if you, well, here's a better way to put it. You can explain Breath of the Wild's plot in a shorter amount of time than you can Persona 5's, but when you when you actually play the game, the plot of Breath of the Wild takes longer to do than Persona 5 does. And the reason being is that Breath of the Wild gives you this free reign momentum. It gives you, you know, all this free reign that you can pretty much do whatever on earth you want to do with. So it does technically take the priority, take the importance, take the emphasis off of the mission of saving Hyrule. Whereas Persona 5, after every main thing you do, you can always then do something immediately afterwards to enhance your gameplay during the dungeon crawling segment, or you can just move on to the next mission or side quest and things like that. There's something always matters in Persona 5, whereas if you kill 50 moblins in Breath of the Wild versus if you kill 3 Lionels, I mean, yeah, you get better equipment, yeah, you get monster parts that you can sell for a lot of money, but none of it contributes to the main plot. There's more of a priority with Persona 5. You have a deadline. With Breath of the Wild, yeah, you have to, well, no, you don't even have to go do all the Divine Beast dungeons, but it helps you for the final boss. But even then, when you do the Divine Beast dungeons, you have the same problem with those bosses that I mentioned earlier. So when it comes to the plot as a whole, I kind of have to give it to Persona because there's more of a priority, more of an emphasis. You feel like you're doing more. You feel like everything you do contributes to something bigger than yourself. Whereas with Legend of Zelda, obviously it doesn't, but that's also a blessing and a curse. So yeah, that's just my point of view. In Breath of the Wild, the freedom it gives, it allows you to completely slack off, and while, you know, that free reign of venturing is good, the free reign does take away the urgency that is to save Hyrule. So finally, this is the final segment that I'm going to be covering, is DLC. Now, without a shadow of a doubt, I'm just going to say this without even, you know, like, discussing it. DLC goes to Breath of the Wild. So Persona 5's DLC, it's pretty much small things like gear, clothes, equipment that don't necessarily contribute to stats majorly. And even too, you have old personas from different games to fill in for the nostalgia. Just to briefly explain, personas are basically the Pokemon of the Persona franchise. It's like, yeah, it's like, because in the Pokemon games, you capture Pokemon. In the Persona games, you capture Personas. So the DLC is pretty much like getting DLC for Pokemon, or, you know, those downloadable GameStop exclusive gift things like a shiny Entei. That's pretty much what the Persona DLC Personas is, except they contribute more and they show off more to the older Persona games. For example, if some of you are familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh, it's like if one of the main Yu-Gi-Oh anime characters gets a card literally handed down from him from the previous Yu-Gi-Oh anime protagonist. So it's very similar to passing the baton via DLC. It doesn't contribute mainly to the plot. I mean, it gives you extra... I mean, it makes you stronger, obviously, because they're overpowered personas that you can buy for $8 or whatever. Don't quote me on that. I don't know how much they cost. But yeah, that's pretty much my thing with Persona, and while it is a good thing that you don't have to buy story elements for Persona 5, Breath of the Wild's DLC is not only story elements, but tons of new gear, quests, shrines, etc. Like, you feel like you're expanding your gameplay even further, but that also does contribute to you being busy not doing the main quest of the game. So the plot in the DLC kind of is a double-edged sword, because, you know, the plot of the game is, yeah, go save Hyrule, but the DLC is like, but, you know, why don't you get the Master Cycle, if you know what I mean. So overall, that's pretty much just my thoughts on Persona versus Breath of the Wild. Now, I actually haven't seen many people compare or quote-unquote fight these games together or pit these games together. Now, I'm not saying that, obviously, people haven't, but both games are huge contenders for the best game of 2017, and I know that Breath of the Wild did get that title, Best Game of 2017, last year, but in my opinion, a lot of that hype, a lot of that momentum, a lot of that love came from Breath of the Wild being an initial release for the Nintendo Switch. In my opinion, if Breath of the Wild was Wii U only, then it would not be Game of the Year, and Persona 5 probably would be. But hey, what do I know? That's just a... No. Anyway, guys, so thank you all for watching. If you want to see more stuff on Persona, Breath of the Wild, anything like that, just let me know. I really enjoy doing videos like this where I talk about two games that I really, really love and kind of, you know, compare the two together. Now, I do want to say that I don't necessarily think that Persona is better than Breath of the Wild or vice versa. These are just different aspects of the game that I think that one game has better than the other. For example, I think the music in Persona 5 is better than it is in Breath of the Wild. I think that the gameplay in Breath of the Wild is better than it is in Persona. Not saying that obviously the turn-based combat is bad, or that the music in Breath of the Wild is bad. It's just my personal taste, my personal experiences. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Yeah, with that being said, peace, guys.